This is Lesson 26, Solving Multi-Step Equations for Mrs. Boyle's math class. I have a couple of reminders at the top of your notes. The first thing is when you are solving multi-step equations, you want to simplify as much as possible, which means get rid of any inclusion symbols by distributing or solving what's inside the symbols. And then after that, you combine like terms. And then second, you want to isolate the variable, like we've talked about before, using reverse order of operations. So the first example here, there aren't any inclusion symbols, so we don't have to do anything there. We just need to combine like terms. So we can circle the 3, or the x and the 4x, and then I'll just put a square around the constants. So I'm going to combine x and 4x to get 5x. And I'm going to combine 3 and negative 10. Since they're opposite signs, I'm going to subtract their absolute values to get 7. And because the 10 is bigger, or has a larger absolute value, I'm going to make that a negative 7, which means subtract 7. And then I still have the 28 on the other side of the equal sign. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm on the second step now, isolate the variable. So I want to get 5x by itself first. I want to get the term by itself. So I need to get rid of this minus 7, so I'm going to do the inverse and add 7. Those will cancel out to be 0. So we'll have 5x equals 35. Okay, our next step is to get x by itself, now that it's a single term. So because it's a single term, it's all multiplication, 5 times x. So we do the inverse, which is divide by 5. And then we're left with x equals 35 divided by 5, which is 7. Okay, the last thing we want to do is check our work. Now when you check your work, you always go back to the equation that you started with. So I'm going to fill in, oh excuse me, that was my little reminder. You want to fill in this x equals 7 for the x's in the original equation. So we have 3 plus 7 minus 10 plus 4 times 7. What we want to do first is multiply 4 times 7, which is 28. And then we can add and subtract from left to right. So 3 plus 7 is 10, and then I have minus 10, and then we have plus 28. And 10 minus 10 is actually 0. So our final answer is 28, which is what we started with here. So we know that that's correct. Moving on to the next example. For the next example, we do have inclusion symbols here. We have parentheses. So we want to get rid of those parentheses by distributing the negative 2. So negative 2 times x is negative 2x. Can't make that match. Negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. And then we still have plus x on the outside equals 16. The next step would be to combine like terms. So we have negative 2x plus 4 is not the same, and then plus x. So negative 2x and x would be negative 1x. It's negative 2 plus 1 is negative 1. And then we have the plus 4 equals 16. The next step is to get this term by itself, which means we have to get rid of the plus 4, so we do the inverse. And now we need to get rid of that negative 1, so we divide by negative 1. And we have x equals negative 12. And again, we need to go back and check. So we're going to start with negative 2. And then in parentheses, we have negative 12 minus 2. And then we have a plus negative 12. Now I'm not filling in what it equals because I want to make sure that that's what this equals is the 16. So the first thing I'm going to do is what's inside the parentheses. So negative 12 minus 2 is negative 14. And negative 2 times negative 14 is positive 28. Positive 28 plus negative 12 is the same thing as 28 minus 12, which is 16. So we're all good. Okay, the next example. Again, we're going to get rid of these inclusion symbols. So we're going to do 2 times 7, which is 14. 2 times negative x is negative 2x. Okay, and I'm going to bring down the 6x. And the plus 10 equals 20. Now we want to combine like terms. So we have a 6x and a negative 2x. So that would be 6 minus 2, which is 4x. And then we have 14 and 10, which is positive 24, equals 20. Now we want to get the variable term by itself. So we subtract 24 on each side. So we have 4x equals negative 4. Then we divide by 4 to get x by itself. So x equals negative 4 divided by 4, which is negative 1. And the last step is to go back and check. So we have 6 times negative 1 plus 2 times the quantity of 7 minus x. And x is negative 1, so I have another negative there for the negative 1, plus 10. So inside the parentheses I have 7 minus negative 1, which they become positive when they're next to each other, so that's 8. Okay, and 6 times negative 1 is negative 6. So I have negative 6 plus 2 times 8, which is 16, plus 10. Negative 6 plus 16 is 10, plus 10 equals 20, which is what we started with over here. So we know that it's correct. Moving on to the next example. Okay, this one, it seems like there's not anything to distribute to the parentheses, but in reality there would be a 1 here, a negative 1 that we're multiplying by what's in the parentheses, because this negative sign is going to change the sign of what's in the parentheses. So the first thing we start with is the 5x. That isn't going to change. Then we're going to distribute this negative sign to the x. So negative 1 times x would be negative x. And then negative 1 times negative 3 would actually be positive 3. Okay, so now we combine like terms and we have 5x minus x. So 5 minus 1 would be 4x. Plus 3 minus 1, which is 2, equals 18. Our next step is to isolate the variable term. So we subtract 2 on both sides. And then the last term is to isolate the x by dividing by 4. So 16 divided by 4 is 4. And the last step, we go back and check. So we have 5 times 4 minus 4 minus 3 minus 1. Okay, so 5 times 4 is 20. Minus 4 minus 3 in the parentheses would be 1. And then minus 1 again. So 20 minus 1 is 19. 19 minus 1 equals 18. Which is what we started with. Okay, moving on to the last example. Okay, Laura cuts a triangle with angles x, 5x, and x plus 40. So if we were going to draw a triangle here, No, this is not the best triangle. Then the angles would be x, 5x, and x plus 40. So we want to know what exactly the angles are. So we need to write an equation here. We know that all the angles in a triangle add up to 180 degrees. So we can write an equation here with x plus 5x plus x plus 40. Those are three angles, and they should equal 180 when they're all added up. So now we can go back and solve for x. So if we get rid of these inclusion symbols here, we'd have x plus 5x plus 1 times x, which is x, and 1 times 40, which is 40. So when there's an addition sign in front of a pair of parentheses, it really doesn't change anything. But when there's a minus sign in front of the parentheses, it changes the sign of everything inside the parentheses. Okay, so the next step would be to combine all these x's. So we have 1x plus 5x, which is 6x, plus another one, which is 7, plus 40 equals 180. Now we want to get this 7x by itself, so we subtract 40. And we have 7x equals 140. And we can divide by 7. And we have x equals 20. Now the question is, what are the measures of the angles? So the first angle is just x. And we already found out that that's 20. So that angle is 20 degrees. It's this angle. And we know that the next one is 5x, which would equal 5 times 20, which would equal 100 degrees. So that would be the second angle. And the third one is x plus 40, which would be 20 plus 40, which equals 60 degrees. So that would be the third angle. Now the last thing you want to do, just to check and make sure, is add those three angles up, 20 plus 100 plus 60, to make sure that they add up to 180 degrees, and they do. So we know that this is correct, and our final answer for the three angles are 20, 100, and 60. And that is the end of today's lesson. Thank you for taking notes and listening.